There are men who commit crimes so enormous that the human mind struggles to fully comprehend the scale of what they did, and who then, when the reckoning comes, simply disappear. Not into some elaborate underground network, not into a new identity in a distant country, but simply into the ordinary fabric of post-war German life, living under assumed names in small towns, working unremarkable jobs, hiding in plain sight. Richard Baer was one of those men. He was the last commandant of Auschwitz, the man who ran the largest and most murderous death camp in the history of human civilization during the final phase of its operation, the period when the gas chambers and crematoria were working at maximum capacity to murder the Jews of Hungary in a killing operation so intensive that the crematoria could not process the bodies fast enough, and the SS was burning corpses in open pits. He ran that camp. He signed the orders. He walked the grounds. He was responsible for everything that happened there during his command. And when the war ended and the world began to understand what had happened inside those camps, Richard Baer put on civilian clothes and disappeared for 15 years. He was not caught by brilliant detective work or international manhunts. He was recognized by a former prisoner who saw his face and knew exactly who he was. He was arrested in 1960, put in a cell to await trial, and died in that cell in 1963 before the trial could begin. He never faced a verdict. He never heard a sentence read out in a courtroom. He escaped justice in the most literal sense possible by dying before justice could reach him. This is his story. Richard Baer was born on September 9, 1911, in Floss, a small town in Bavaria, into a Germany that was still a monarchy and that had no particular reason at that moment to produce the kind of man that Baer would become. His background was ordinary in every respect that mattered. His family was working class, his education was conventional, and his early life gave no outward indication of the path he would eventually take. He joined the Nazi Party and the SS in 1930 when he was 19 years old, which placed him among the early believers, the men who had committed to the movement before it came to power, before it was safe or advantageous to do so, when joining the SS meant joining a street-fighting organization whose future was genuinely uncertain. That early commitment reflected a genuine ideological conviction that would remain constant throughout his career, and that would eventually make him one of the men the regime trusted with its most secret and most criminal operations. He worked as a pastry chef before his SS career took over his life entirely, which is one of those biographical details that seems almost impossible to reconcile with what came later. The man who would run Auschwitz had once made cakes and bread for a living. He rose through the SS hierarchy through the 1930s, demonstrating the combination of ideological reliability and administrative competence that the organization rewarded with advancement. He was assigned to the concentration camp system in the late 1930s, working at Neuengamme and Dachau in administrative roles that gave him experience of how the camps functioned and what was required to run them efficiently. He was not an unusual figure in the SS concentration camp administration. He was one of hundreds of men who processed through those roles, learning the systems, absorbing the culture of casual brutality that pervaded the camps, becoming the kind of man who could oversee mass murder as a matter of administrative routine. He served on the Eastern Front briefly in 1941 and 1942 as the SS committed formations to the German invasion of the Soviet Union, but his primary value to the regime was administrative rather than military. and he was returned to the concentration camp system where his skills were more directly useful. He was assigned to Auschwitz in 1944, arriving at the camp in May of that year, at a moment when Auschwitz was in the process of carrying out the largest single killing operation in its history. The Hungarian Jews were arriving in the spring and summer of 1944. Hungary had been occupied by German forces in March 1944, after the Hungarian government began making approaches to the Allies, and the SS immediately began the deportation of the Hungarian Jewish population that they had been prevented from carrying out as long as Hungary remained nominally independent. Adolf Eichmann coordinated the deportations from Budapest, and the trains ran to Auschwitz with a regularity and a volume that pushed the camp's killing capacity to its absolute limits. In the peak weeks of the Hungarian deportations in May and June 1944, the SS was murdering 10,000 people a day at Auschwitz. 10,000 people a day. The 4 crematoria that had been built to dispose of the bodies could not keep up with that rate of killing, and the SS resorted to burning bodies in open pits dug in the ground near the gas chambers, pits that burned day and night, and whose smoke could be seen and smelled for miles around the camp. Richard Baer became Commandant of Auschwitz in May 1944, replacing Richard Höss, who had been brought back temporarily to oversee the Hungarian operation, and who then moved to a senior administrative role in the broader SS concentration camp system. Baer took command of a camp that was at the peak of its murderous activity, and he ran it with the administrative efficiency that the SS expected of its senior concentration camp officers. He was not a sadist in the way that some concentration camp commanders were, not a man who derived personal pleasure from the suffering of prisoners in the way that certain figures in the camp history are documented as having done. He was something in some ways more troubling, a bureaucrat of mass murder, a man who understood his role as administrative and managerial, who kept the systems running and the paperwork in order and the killing operations proceeding on schedule without the kind of personal involvement that might have registered as emotional engagement with what was actually happening. The selection process at the Auschwitz ramp, where newly arrived prisoners were divided into those who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers and those who would be registered as camp prisoners and used for forced labor, continued under Baer's command. SS doctors, including Joseph Mengele, conducted these selections, pointing left or right as the prisoners filed past, making the decisions that determined within minutes of arrival whether a person would live or die. Baer oversaw the administrative apparatus that processed these decisions, that recorded the numbers of prisoners registered, that coordinated the logistics of moving people from the trains to the gas chambers, that managed the crematoria and the open burning pits, that maintained the camp as a functioning killing operation at the scale the regime demanded. The pace of killing began to slow in the autumn of 1944 as the Hungarian deportations were completed and as the military situation deteriorated to the point where even Himmler recognized that the evidence of what had happened at Auschwitz needed to be destroyed before the Soviet advance reached it. The gassing operations at Auschwitz were halted in November 1944. The crematoria were demolished. The SS began a frantic effort to destroy the documentary evidence of what had taken place, burning records and dismantling the physical infrastructure of mass murder in a race against the advancing Soviet forces. Baer oversaw parts of this destruction operation as Commandant, participating in the attempt to erase the evidence of crimes that the regime was beginning to understand it might one day be held accountable for. In January 1945, as the Soviet forces approached, the SS evacuated the remaining prisoners from Auschwitz in the death marches that killed thousands of people who had survived the camp only to die on the roads of southern Poland in the middle of winter. Baer was involved in the organization of this evacuation, another chapter in the same story of administrative mass murder that had defined his command. The Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, and found the remnants of what had been there, the warehouses full of confiscated belongings, the remaining prisoners too sick to march, the physical evidence of the crematoria and gas chambers that the SS demolition teams had not fully destroyed. The world that confronted the liberation of Auschwitz was confronting something that it did not yet have the conceptual vocabulary to fully describe. Richard Baer did not stay to face that confrontation. He disappeared. In the chaos of the final months of the war and the immediate post-war period, he shed his SS identity, assumed a false name, and became one of the thousands of former SS men who were trying to blend back into ordinary German society before the Allied occupation authorities could identify and arrest them. He used the name Karl Neumann. He moved to a region of northern Germany where he was not known. He found work as a forester, a physical outdoor job that kept him away from populated areas and reduced the chances of being recognized by someone who knew his face from the camp. He lived this way for 15 years. 15 years during which the Nuremberg trials were held and their verdicts rendered, during which the West German state was established and began its complicated and not always honest process of coming to terms with the Nazi past, during which survivors of Auschwitz were giving testimony and providing names and descriptions of the men who had run the camp, and during which Richard Baer was cutting trees in a forest and living as Karl Neumann, and apparently believing that he had successfully escaped the consequences of what he had done. The Auschwitz trials that the West German authorities eventually organized were the result of a long and difficult process of building cases against the men who had staffed and administered the camp. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which began in 1963, were a landmark moment in post-war German legal history, the first time that a German court conducted a comprehensive examination of what had happened at Auschwitz and held those responsible accountable under German law. The preparation for these trials required identifying the men who had served at the camp in positions of authority, locating them, and building evidentiary cases against them. Richard Baer was identified as someone who needed to be found and prosecuted. The search for him was not the kind of dramatic international manhunt that some post-war Nazi hunting operations involved. It was more prosaic, more dependent on the patient accumulation of testimony and the cross-referencing of survivor accounts with whatever documentary records had survived the war. Former prisoners who had been at Auschwitz during Baer's command could describe him, could confirm that he had been there and what his role had been, and the investigation gradually narrowed toward the man living as Karl Neumann in the forests of northern Germany. He was arrested in December 1960 near Hamburg. A former prisoner had recognized him. The man who had commanded Auschwitz during the peak of its killing operations, who had overseen the murder of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews, who had managed the administrative machinery of the largest death camp in history, was working as a forester under a false name, and had apparently believed that the passage of 15 years and a change of location were sufficient to put his crimes behind him. He was 49 years old when he was arrested, which meant that he had spent roughly a third of his adult life hiding from the consequences of what he had done during the other 2/3. He was held in custody while the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials were being prepared. He consistently denied everything. He denied knowledge of the gas chambers. He denied involvement in the selection process. He denied that the killings had taken place on the scale that the evidence documented. He maintained the position that many former SS concentration camp personnel maintained when confronted with the evidence of what they had done. The position that whatever had happened without their knowledge or participation, that they had been administrators and nothing more, that the crimes documented by survivors and by the SS's own records were either exaggerated or attributable to others. This denial was not credible given the evidence against him, but it was the only defense available to a man who could not plausibly claim ignorance of what Auschwitz was. He died in custody on June 17, 1963, before the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials had formally begun. The cause of death was recorded as heart failure. He was 51 years old. He had been in custody for less than 3 years. He had never stood in a courtroom to hear the charges against him formally presented. He had never heard a verdict. He had never been sentenced. The man who had commanded Auschwitz during the murder of hundreds of thousands of people died in a cell in Frankfurt without being held legally accountable for any of it. The reaction to his death was complicated. For survivors of Auschwitz who had hoped to see Baer face a court and hear a verdict rendered against him, his death was a profound frustration. Another instance of the broader pattern in which the German legal system's slow and sometimes reluctant pursuit of Nazi war criminals allowed men to die before justice could reach them. For the prosecutors preparing the Frankfurt trials, his death removed one of the most significant defendants from the case they had been building, leaving a gap in the proceedings that could not be filled. For Baer himself, death had provided the escape that 15 years of hiding had eventually failed to deliver. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials proceeded without him, running from December 1963 to August 1965, and resulting in convictions for 17 of the 22 defendants. The trials were a landmark in German legal and historical reckoning with the Nazi past, producing a detailed public record of what had happened at Auschwitz that educated a German public that had not always been fully informed about the specifics of what the camps had been and what had taken place inside them. Richard Baer was not among the defendants who stood in that Frankfurt courtroom and heard that record read out. He had died 6 months before the trials began. Richard Baer is not a name that many people know today, even among those who know the history of Auschwitz reasonably well. He is overshadowed in the public memory of the camp by Rudolf Höss, the Commandant who built and developed Auschwitz into the killing machine it became, and who was tried at Nuremberg and hanged at Auschwitz itself in 1947, in what was one of the most symbolically significant executions of the post-war period. Höss has a face and a story and a trial and a verdict and an execution that gave his role in the history of the camp a kind of narrative completion that Baer's story lacks. Baer has a cell and a heart attack and an absence where a verdict should have been. But Baer's story matters precisely because of that absence. It is a story about what happens when the systems that are supposed to deliver accountability fail to do so quickly enough, when the combination of deliberate concealment and institutional slowness means that a man who commanded a death camp can live for 15 years in the same country as the survivors of that camp without being called to account. It is a story about the limits of justice when it confronts crimes of this magnitude, about the gap between what happened and what the law was able to do about it. It is a story about a man who believed, for 15 years, that he had gotten away with it, and who in a certain terrible sense was right. The victims of Auschwitz during Richard Baer's command did not get to disappear. They did not get to assume false names and find work in forests and live out their lives in quiet anonymity. They were murdered, most of them within hours of arriving at the camp, in gas chambers that Baer administered and crematoria that Baer oversaw. He lived for 18 years after the war ended. He spent 15 of those years hiding, and 3 of them in a cell. He died without a verdict, and the people he helped to kill never got to live at all. That is the story of Richard Baer. Not a story of dramatic evil or demonic charisma, a story of bureaucratic complicity in the worst crime in human history, followed by cowardice, followed by 15 years of hiding, followed by a death that cheated justice of the verdict it had earned. History has not forgotten what happened at Auschwitz, and history has not forgotten the name of the man who ran it.